Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth session in American English Live, Series 15. We're so excited that each of you are here with us today. My name is Kate, and I'll be with you today along with my colleague behind the scenes, Elena, who will be the moderator helping answer your questions and responding to your comments during the session. Let's begin today with these wonderful audience comments from our most recent webinar, Implementing Peer Assessment in Project-Based Learning with Julie Saris. So Fariza in Kazakhstan wrote, I really appreciate this webinar as it was really difficult to use peer assessment for my students. Now with clear instructions, I have lots of great ideas and am more confident. Thank you very much. And Haymar in Burma wrote, this was a really informative session. I will definitely use graphic organizers and sentence prompts. Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful comment. And finally, from Jamile in Bolivia, this has been very useful, especially because I was a bit afraid of using oral peer assessment. However, now I see with rubrics and the correct guidance, it is possible and manageable. Wonderful comments. Thank you so much for all of those great comments. And we love to see our teacher participants actively engaged in professional development. So please continue to share your thoughts about our webinars by offering your feedback through the end of session quiz form or by emailing your ideas to americanenglishwebinars@fhi360.org. We may feature one of your comments during the next webinar. So throughout Series 15, we've been exploring the themes of using music in the EFL classroom, project-based learning, and multi-level classrooms. We hope you are able to use the practical ideas we share. Here's what to expect today. The session is about 60 minutes long. The presenter will present the material, and I, as your host, will ask questions and make comments too. But we really hope to hear from you, our audience, so that we can address your ideas and experiences. Please share your thoughts using the comments feature or chat box. When our session comes to a close, you will have an opportunity to receive a digital badge for your participation. At the end of the webinar, we'll share a link in the comments. Click on that link and complete a short quiz about today's session. You must answer 2 out of 3 multiple choice questions correctly. Once you have successfully passed the quiz, you can expect to get your badge via email within about a week. And before we begin, we want to make sure you are aware of our free, massive, open online course, English as a Medium of Instruction. This course is to help you redevelop your existing courses or create new ones that use English as a Medium of Instruction, EMI. Participants will develop strategies for successfully helping students learn course content while simultaneously building or refining their English skills. Course topics include course design, syllabi development, lesson and materials creation, and much more. The course is open now, so visit the link being shared in the chat and comments to learn more and enroll. And now let's begin today's webinar, Becoming a News Reporter, a case study in project-based learning. Project-based learning is an excellent way for students to practice and improve their English, develop critical thinking, and engage in meaningful, relevant learning within their local context. This webinar will equip teachers to design exciting project-based learning experiences that will sharpen students' English language and critical thinking skills. We'll take an in-depth look at a project in which English students created television-style newscasts about issues in their community. We'll examine the process of setting up and implementing the project and discuss what students gained from it. We'll also talk about how to overcome the challenges teachers often face with project-based learning. Throughout the webinar, participants will be encouraged to think of project ideas that would work well in their own teaching contexts. And now we're pleased to introduce our presenter, Jeremy Beal. Jeremy is a curriculum designer and English language teacher with over a decade of experience working in the US and abroad. He began his career in the field of language education with 4 years in Indonesia, where he first realized his passion for language and culture while learning and teaching on the islands of Java, Sumatra, and Madura. He later returned to Indonesia as a U.S. Department of State English Language Fellow, teaching for 3 years at Universitas Sam Ratulangi in the city of Manado. In addition to teaching overseas, Jeremy has taught English classes at several schools in Southern California, including the Cal Poly English Language Institute, the American Language Institute at California State University, Long Beach, and Golden West College. Jeremy holds a master's in TESOL from Biola University. Welcome, Jeremy. We're so happy to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Kate, and hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be joining you today or tonight, depending on where you are for this webinar. Today, I'll be taking a close look at a project I did with a class of my students, and then we'll talk about how you can use similar projects to develop your students' language and critical thinking skills. First, let's look at an overview of today's webinar. So the first thing we'll do is look at a definition of project-based learning. In particular, we'll talk about the characteristics of a good project. Next, we'll look at a case study in which students produce news videos about a problem in their community. We'll talk about the reasons why I did the project, the process of doing the project, and some of the challenges that I faced. After that, we'll talk about how you can set up a project for your own students. And then finally, we'll talk about how to adapt project ideas for students in different contexts. So let's start with a definition of project-based learning and what we mean when we talk about doing a project with students. So what is project-based learning? Well, project-based learning is a type of learning where students learn by working on an extended project. This isn't an assignment that you do at the end of a unit of study to assess what your students have learned, but instead the project is the means for the students to learn. So they learn different skills by doing the project. So in that way, it's a way of learning by doing. The students are actively engaged in doing the project, and that helps them to learn English skills. They don't start out the project knowing how to do everything they need to do, and so they'll learn the skills they need as they go. A project is a bit like building a house. So imagine if you were going to build a house. Now, if you're like me, you're not an expert builder. I'm an English teacher and I feel very comfortable teaching English, but I don't really know what I'm doing when it comes to building a house. So I would need somebody to show me, to teach me the steps and take me through the stages of building a house. So project-based learning is the same way. Okay, first of all, if you're building a house, you're probably not doing it by yourself. And in the same way, project-based learning is collaborative. So the students work in groups to make their project. Building a house also takes a long time. It definitely takes more than a day. It has many stages, like laying the foundation, building the framework, and many other stages. And in the same way, project-based learning takes more than one class period. It could be a week or a few weeks. It could even take an entire semester. When you build a house, it's very experiential. It's very hands-on, and you get lots of hands-on practice as you put the house together. And project-based learning is also very hands-on. So the students should get lots of English practice through the process of doing their project. When you build a house, you use many different skills, like using a hammer, using a drill, measuring, and all the other things that go into building a house. And in the same way, project-based learning requires different language skills. Students might be doing listening and speaking, or reading and writing. They might need particular vocabulary. They might need to use particular parts of grammar, or they might combine all these together. When you build a house, it's very relevant. It's very useful because you can live in the house, and a good project should also be relevant to students' lives in some way. Finally, once the house is built, it's a public product. Many people can go and see it. And in the same way, a good project has a public component to it. So the students will be sharing, preferably beyond their classroom. Now let's look at a few examples of projects that have these characteristics. So the first project on this slide is to conduct a survey, then analyze and present the results. So students would choose a topic, write questions, and then go out into some part of the community and ask their survey questions. In that way, it's very public. because they'll be interacting with different people. Afterwards, when they present their results, this is another form of a public product as they can share with their classmates or perhaps with other classes or even a wider audience. Another example of a project would be to create a website about local culture for foreign visitors. This one's great because it's very relevant to the students' local context. I think whenever you get a chance to teach the students how to talk about their own community and their own culture, it's very motivating and very useful and very relevant to students. And of course, since this project involves creating a website, it's very public. Anyone who has access to the internet would be able to see it. And then the final project on this slide is to produce a school magazine or newspaper. So again, this is a very public product. The whole school community would be able to see it. It involves different language skills, like, of course, reading and writing, but perhaps it also includes some speaking and listening as the students go out and interview different people. So now that we've looked at a few examples of projects, I'd like to hear about your experience using projects. So what is a project that you've used with your students? For example, maybe in the chat you could type, I had my high school students create a tourist brochure about our town.
Yeah, great question. Let us know, everybody. What is a project you've used with your students? Let us know. And we have some nice comments. One from Mevish, who says, through project-based learning, students become more social as they share their ideas and things with others. And Norman wrote, learning by doing enables the individual to build strong problem-solving tools. Wonderful. So those are really nice comments. Thank you for sharing those. What is a project that you have used with your students? Let us know. Let's take a look here. I used a project on their dream school to learn what they really want in their school. Very nice, from Krishna. Naying says an e-magazine and travel plan. Wonderful. Roger says my students are now working on our school magazine. That's great. Dina has a class newsletter. Erwin has used a food brochure. Let's see. Writing about local places, great. Bushra says, I had my students do a plantation project in monsoon season. Very interesting. And let's take one more look. Class magazine about Harry Potter. Love it. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for sharing.
I love hearing those project ideas. It sounds like a lot of you have done projects that are really relevant to your communities. And so I'm sure that many of you already understand many of the benefits of project-based learning. So let's look at some of those benefits. First of all, project-based learning is practical. Your students are learning English for a purpose. They have a specific goal, and they need to use their English to accomplish that goal. This makes it very motivating. So it's engaging and it's rewarding for students. They're not just doing worksheets from a textbook, but they're making something that will be on public display. And so they want to do a good job. The best projects are relevant to students' lives and to their community. So you can tailor a project to fit your local context. When you have a textbook or a course book, it's usually not specific to your local context. So project-based learning allows you to really hone in on something that the students will be interested in, that will be useful for them. Projects can also develop critical thinking skills. So you can design a project that will get students really thinking critically about an issue that affects their lives, and then have them talk or write about it in English. And finally, project-based learning integrates English skills in an authentic way. All right, now that we have a clear definition of project-based learning, let's take a close look at a project that incorporated these elements. So I did this project at an Indonesian public university, and my students were undergraduate English majors in their second year of study. They were taking the 4th semester of a 4-course integrated speaking and listening sequence. The university was located in a major city of about 425,000 people, and many of the students were from that city, but there were also many students that came from smaller towns in the surrounding regions. Now, before we go any further, I'd like to hear a little about your teaching context. So projects can be designed for any context, so it'll be helpful for me to know a little bit about your classes. So if you could tell a little bit about your teaching context in the chat, say the age of your students, their proficiency level, and whether you're in a big city or a small town. So for example, you could say high school, beginners, small town.
All right, let us know, everybody. What is your teaching context? Age of your students, proficiency level, and whether you teach in a big city or a small town. Let's see, Miss Tang wrote 16 to 18-year-olds in high school in Beijing. All right, must be a town near Beijing because I think Beijing is really big. Krishna says, oh, I see. We have 12 to 18-year-old students in a big city. Wow, Karima, you teach ages 6 to adults. My goodness, you must be very, very busy. Let's see, high school beginners, small town, also from Du. Leanne says high school advanced and in a big city. Ari says university, medium city, and mixed levels. Isa says high school in a city. Nancy teaches in Mexico in a public university. Masaudi says, I teach in a rural area, secondary school, intermediate students. And Salik says small town students. So I think we have a really wide range of teaching contexts represented here today. Thanks for sharing, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And so the project I'll describe I did with university students, but later we'll also be talking about how you can adapt this project and others for different teaching contexts, for different levels of students and different ages. So now let's talk about the details of this project. So what I had my students do was to create a news report about a problem in the community. They needed to discuss the background of the problem and also the causes and effects of the problem. They worked in groups of 3, and I let the students choose their own topic. So some of them chose to talk about a trash problem that they noticed in the city. Some of them talked about the traffic. One group talked about the electricity crisis that was happening at the time. And one group talked about bullying, so more of a social problem. The videos needed to be 4 to 5 minutes long. Now let's look at the timeline of the project. The project went for about 6 weeks. I think I allowed them a little more time than that, but this is was my original plan, 6 weeks. And the class met 2 times a week for 50 minutes each class period. So you can see here on the table what I did in each week. In week 1, I introduced the project and the students, well, I formed groups and then the students chose their topics. In the second week, they began to write their script. And at the end of the third week, they submitted the completed script for their news report. I gave them feedback on their scripts at the beginning of week 4 so that they could make revisions to the grammar and word choice and things like that, and even the organization of the news scripts. And then after that, they started to practice the pronunciation of the script. In week 5, they started to create their videos. And then at the end of week 6, their project was due. Finally, we had a viewing party at the very end, which was the public aspect of the project. Now, I didn't require the students to do any kind of formal response when they watched their classmates' videos, but this would have been a great opportunity for some peer assessment, just like the topic of the last webinar was on peer assessment and project-based learning. So that viewing party that we did would have been a great time to do that. Now, the students received some time during class to work with their groups, but most of the work was done outside of class. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned yet is the learning objectives. What did I want students to learn from this project? So I'd like to hear from you now. What is one thing that you think students probably gained from this project? Go ahead and write your answers in the chat.
Yeah, let us know, everyone. What is one thing students probably gained from this project? What do you think? Let's see. Karima, that's a great question. I think we're going to talk about that soon. All right. Asran says, yes, we're going to, they might learn grammar and writing skills. Great. Shining says collaboration. And Ari also says they probably learned collaboration skills. Great. Michael Lee says critical thinking. Absolutely. And Kuniko agrees, critical thinking and creativity. Let's see, Alsra says teamwork. Great. So it looks like a lot of people are thinking on the same line. Miss Tang also says teamwork. Manana says teamwork. So does Syed. Key says they learn about the content or info itself and then about the language, and they also learn collaboration skills. Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Great thoughts, everyone. Thanks for your comments.
Mhm. So absolutely, I hear a lot of you saying collaboration and teamwork, and that is absolutely something that students practiced. And I think that's something that you would get with just about any project that you would do. So that's a great element of project-based learning, the way it encourages collaboration. Well, let's look at the actual objectives that I had in mind when I designed this project. So the first objective was students would explain the background, causes, and effects of a problem in their local community. This is where the critical thinking came in, because I really wanted them to take a close look at their community and how different problems happen and how they affect their lives. The second major objective was to design an effective news report. So they needed to have an attention-grabbing intro. They needed to convey the information in a certain interesting way using interviews, narration, and other things. They needed to have a good conclusion, and so on. And then the final objective was about the language objectives, and my focus was on speaking. So I wanted them to use appropriate grammar and vocabulary that was specific to the topic. They needed to speak with clear pronunciation, and they needed to speak fluently. Now, for the interviews, that second objective there involved some interviews. And so since we were in a English as a foreign language context, the students used their native language to conduct the interviews. But they still got practice using English, because when they put the interview into the news report, they did a voiceover in English. So they did it exactly the way it's done on local TV. They would ask the question in the local language, and then they'd have a voiceover in English there. They asked for permission before they did the interviews, and this generally wasn't a problem. Most people were fine with doing an interview for a school project in this particular context. So let's look at how I set up the project, just a couple different issues. First, how I assigned the groups. Now, whenever you assign groups, there's always the question of what do you do with students of different ability levels? Do you put them in the same group together, or do you have like a lower level group, a more advanced group? I chose to put them in mixed ability level groups. So I made sure that each group had one person that was more on the advanced side, at least, and then probably someone that was a little bit less proficient at English. And I felt this was really effective, because the students were able to learn from each other, and the lower proficiency students were able to learn a lot from those that were more proficient. I also considered personality a little bit and tried to put students in groups with other students that I knew they would get along with. Of course, you can't always do this effectively, and so sometimes part of a project is just for students to learn how to work together, even with people that they might not get along with all the time. Now, as for choosing the topics, I had the students select the topics in their groups. Sometimes the students, a couple of different groups, wanted the same topic. And so if that were to happen in your context, you could ask the different groups to consider a different aspect of the same topic. So for example, 2 of my groups wanted to report on the traffic problem in the city. So one group focused on a new policy the city had recently enacted called the one-way traffic policy. And the other group focused on road hazards, like things like holes in the road and debris in the road that can cause traffic problems. So if you have a larger class, I think it's probably fine to even have groups with the same topic, just because each group is going to do it a different way, and it'll be unique, even though they're on the same topic. Another issue with project setup, since they're working in groups, is on dividing the workload. So I wanted to give my students as much autonomy as possible. I felt like if they got to make as many decisions as possible, it gives them ownership and it's more motivating. So they feel like the project is truly theirs. But Sometimes you can't always do that. So sometimes some groups will need a little bit more teacher intervention to help divide roles, decide on roles and divide work within the group. But in my case, I was able to let the students do that. Now, I did require, I had a video requirement. So each person in the group needed to speak for at least 1 minute on the newscast, because of course, an important element of this project was the students' language skills. And I wanted every student to practice their speaking. So now let's look at why I did this project. First of all, it was really relevant to students. I wanted them to use English to describe their community. I thought that was very valuable for them, and this would be an exciting project for them to do. Second, it required critical thinking. I really wanted students to think critically about their community. What problems could they see? What were the causes of the problems? How did the problems affect people's lives? This is a real authentic real-world use of English, and it's different in a way than a typical school project. It really gets them thinking about their community. I, of course, wanted them to expand their vocabulary, and the students needed to learn a lot of new vocabulary to discuss their topics. And finally, I knew that this project, because they were recording themselves and then everybody would see it, I knew they would get lots of speaking practice. Just like when someone's making a movie, there are multiple takes and they keep doing it over and over until they get it perfect. I knew my students would practice over and over until they were speaking with clear pronunciation and saying things just right. And that repetition is really valuable, especially for increasing speaking fluency. So let's look at the scaffolding of the project, how I prepared students for the project. Now, if you saw Dr. Tabitha Kidwell's webinar a month ago, she talked all about scaffolding for project-based learning. Scaffolding includes all the steps you need to take to prepare your students to do a project. It can include lessons that you teach. It can include giving feedback to students and all kinds of activities where the students are building their skills so they can do the project. So I'd like you to think about what my students needed to be able to do to create their news reports. So for example, they needed to understand the typical format of a news report. They needed to choose a topic. They needed to use vocabulary to talk clearly about their topic. They needed to write a script, and they needed to speak with clear pronunciation. So now think, if you were the teacher, what activities could you do to prepare students to do those things? In the chat, please type one activity that could help prepare students for this project. For example, you could write, in small groups, students brainstorm community problems.
Yeah, let us know, everybody. If you were the teacher, what activities could you do to prepare students for this project and these tasks? What do you think, everyone? Let's see, you could do grammar, a grammar bank, or share verb phrases. Great, from Joelma. You could do a storytelling activity from Javed. You could do a needs assessment from Manana. Very nice. Krishna says you can have a discussion on the problem. Asran says you could interview people from the community. Key says you could give relative materials for them to imitate or follow, like a template. That's a great idea. Let's see. You could discuss the parts of a news report or some tips on delivery. Great, from Jennifer. Lots of people saying that you could do discussions. Role play from Nasir. You can show the sample first from Miss Tang. Great idea. Vocabulary bank from Ronald. And let's see, you can do a lot of brainstorming and vocabulary building. Wonderful. Thanks, everyone.
Well, those are great ideas, and I did a lot of those things. The other things, I wish I had done some of those. So those are great. So let's look at some of the activities that I did throughout the semester to prepare the students. So we did have class brainstorming sessions where we just talked together about issues in the local community. We also did a lot of listening lessons where we'd watch news videos about community issues similar to what the students would do for their project. And from those, we were able to talk about the structure of a news report. Also from those listening lessons, we used those as an opportunity for vocabulary development. So I had the students focus on specific vocabulary that were related to the topic of the news reports that we watched. I gave them feedback on their written scripts. That's a form of scaffolding. The students did some pronunciation practice, and I gave them pronunciation feedback. And we did have quite a few small group discussions about community issues. So these are just a few of the things that we did for scaffolding. Now, there were a lot of challenges to doing this project. I'd never done a project like this before, and so I wasn't really sure how well it would work. So I'd like you to think about what you think would be challenging about this project from a teacher's perspective. So write one question about a challenge of doing this project. For example, how did you teach the students to edit the videos?
Yes, and I saw that question earlier from one of our participants about editing the videos. So that's a great question. So yeah, everyone, please write a question in the chat box regarding a challenge of doing this project. Karima says, how about feedback? Do you have to focus on vocabulary, or what do you focus on? Great question. Let's see, what other questions do you have about this project that involve maybe a challenge you're thinking about? Ms. Tang says, how did you correct students' grammar mistakes? Great. Krishna is asking also, how did you collect the data or the language they would use about the community? Wonderful. What other questions do you have, everybody? All right, Adila says, not all students have a computer. How do you face that challenge? Great question. And Hamid says, how would you edit the videos and get the data? And one more here, how do you work on pronunciation? Great, from Asran. All right, thanks everybody for sharing.
All right, well, I'd like to address a few of those questions. So one question was about the feedback I gave, what I focused on, and a related question, someone asked how I corrected the students' grammar. So the main way I corrected the students' grammar and word choice was through the written script that they did. So after they submitted the script, I gave them some feedback to help them improve their grammar and word choice. I also helped them when they were working in their groups during class. I would monitor and assist the groups as needed with things like grammar, vocabulary, and also with pronunciation. I think I heard a question about how I helped the students with their pronunciation. And honestly, that was one of the big challenges with this project. With so many different students, all with their own pronunciation problems, I don't think I did a very good job of giving feedback on their pronunciation. So if I did it again, I would probably do some mini lessons with the whole class on common pronunciation issues, especially related to word stress, and maybe on intonation too. So great question. There was a question about how the students or how I collected data for the students' topics. And so since these were university students, I let them go out and collect their own data. So some of them talked to people in the community. Some of them got data from the actual news, the newspaper or news reports in the community. And they also just used their own observations of what they saw in the community. And then finally, the question about not all students having a computer, absolutely, that's true. So one of the nice things was that since they were working in groups, we were able to make sure that each group had at least one student that did have a computer. And the other thing that helped is that just about every student had a smartphone of some sort. So they were able to use those to take video and to do other parts of the project. So great questions about those challenges. Now I'd like to talk about how I overcame a couple other challenges. So one challenge was how I generated interest in the project. So the main way I did this was just by making sure it was relevant to students' lives. So because it was a problem that the students, they had to talk about a problem they saw every day in their daily lives, I think this helped to make it interesting for them. I tried to show interesting examples too, interesting models of news reports to get them thinking about how they could design their own news report. And finally, I think a project like this is very realistic and useful for the students. And I think it felt special to my students to be doing something that really was very meaningful to them. And so it did generate a lot of interest. I'm often asked how to help students work in groups. So one absolutely necessary thing I feel is to provide time to work during class. And then when the students are working, to actively monitor the groups. So you can check in. You don't always have to intervene, but you can listen in and see that they're staying on topic. You can make yourself available for questions. Sometimes I'll ask if they have any questions. And then if you hear anything that they're getting wrong, like as far as vocabulary or pronunciation, you can offer a gentle correction to the group. So if you can monitor the groups during group work in class, it's very helpful. Another thing that helps groups is to break the project into smaller steps. This really makes it easier for them to focus and work effectively. You can even provide periodic deadlines or even goals for what they should accomplish in a single class period. Finally, if you need to, you can help students choose roles if they're having trouble deciding on those roles. It's good to allow as much autonomy as possible, as I mentioned earlier, because it's motivating, but you can provide assistance if needed. All right, well, now that we've talked about the challenges and looked at in depth at that case study, let's talk about the steps to setting up a class project. So the very first step is to determine the learning objectives. So you look at your curriculum, decide which objectives you want to focus on with the project, and then you can go with those. If you want, if you're doing a long project, you could choose all of the objectives for a class. That's certainly possible. Or you could just choose one or a few. The second step is to decide on the type of project. So think of a project that will fulfill those objectives, and then think about a couple questions. What is relevant in your context? So how can you connect it to students' lives? And what is realistic? Think about the time that you have available and the time students have available to work. Think about the resources you have available and also the resources that the students have available. Like, do they have access to a computer? That determines what kind of project you do. After you've decided on the type of project, you can define the project parameters. So these are the requirements for the project. Decide what the project components are. For my news report project, there were just two basic components. There was the written script of the news report and then the actual video. But some projects have many more components. You also need to decide on the time limit. If students are speaking, how long should they speak? And is there a limit to how long they can speak? If they're producing some written work, how long does it need to be? Next, you can define the assessment criteria. Think about how you will assess student work. Now, a great way to assess projects is with a rubric. And I think this is something that the previous presenters, two presenters, have talked about in their sessions as well. So I'd like to know about your experience using rubrics. If you could answer in the chat, how have you used rubrics with your students?
Yeah, let us know, everybody. How have you used rubrics in your classroom? What do you think? Let's see. I know we've had some really nice ideas on rubrics and checklists in our past couple of webinars. Maybe you've used some even since those webinars. What do you think, everyone? How have you used rubrics with your students? For assessment? Great. What else? What other ways have you used rubrics? Let's see. To provide guidance before students participate in the task. Great. Ahmed says as a checklist. Caroline uses rubrics for projects and Mumal uses them for presentations. Shugla uses them to assess students' creative writing. One participant uses them as a self-assessment tool. Great. Joelma shares rubrics with students so they know her expectations. Manuel as well. Great. And Chilo says she uses them for students so that they know what to do. Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Great ideas.
Great. It sounds like a lot of you have a lot of experience using the rubrics, and so I think that's great. Let's just look at a couple tips for using rubrics, some best practices. So one thing is to make sure that you match the grading criteria to the learning objectives. So if you're asking the students to design a news report with an introduction and then interviews and conclusion, those would probably be some of the grading criteria. How did they do the intro? How did they do the conclusion? You might consider giving both a group and an individual grade, because every student has a different level of English proficiency. I feel like it's important to have that individual grade to reflect the student's work and the student's progress with their English. But because it's a group project, I also like having a group grade as well. So I do a mix of both. And then finally, I noticed many of you mentioned that you use the rubrics so students know what to expect or know what you expect and what they should do, kind of a guide for them. And so that's great, because if you can give students the rubric at the beginning of the project, it really helps them to know how to go about doing their project. Now let's look at the rubric that I used for the news report project. So this is the first half of the rubric, and this was based on the content of the news report itself. I made this a group grade. So on the left, you can see the grading criteria. So they needed to thoroughly explain the background of the problem that they chose. They needed to describe the causes and the effects. They needed to have an effective introduction and an effective conclusion. And then they needed to portray the problem in an interesting way using interviews, narration, and other elements. So those aligned with my objectives that I had for the project. I kept the scoring really simple to make it easy for me to grade. So there were only 3 possible scores: yes, somewhat, or no. So if they fulfilled the grading criteria, they got a score of yes, 2 points. If they partially fulfilled it, I gave them a 1, somewhat. And then if they didn't fulfill it at all, then they got the lowest score for that. And then, of course, I provided some comments to explain why they got the grade that they got. Now, the next part of the rubric was the individual grade, and it was focused on speaking skills. So let's take a look at the next part of the rubric. So this one, because it was focused on speaking skills, the criteria were pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary, and fluency. I was focused on comprehensible speech, not perfect speech. I didn't expect them to make 0 errors. I thought there could be some errors, but my focus was on making sure their speech was easy to understand. So if their speech was clear and easy to understand, if their grammar was mostly accurate, then they got the highest score. If there were some problems, just a few problems errors that they made that made it difficult to understand, then they got the medium, the middle score. And if there were a lot of errors that made it difficult to understand, then they would get the lowest score. This part, I also focused on using topic-specific vocabulary. So I gave them a grade based on how well they used that. I really do recommend using a rubric for a project because it does make the grading process a lot easier and it makes it much more objective. So once you've set up project parameters and your assessment scheme, you're ready to create a timeline. On your timeline, you'll want to include key due dates. Are there any components of the project? When are those components due? You should probably include when you plan to give feedback to the students, because you want to give them enough time to respond to your feedback and improve their work before they turn in the final product. And then finally, if you want, you can include any scaffolding activities or lessons on the timeline as well. After that, the final step is to evaluate the success of the project. So once everything is done and you've already graded the students' work, it's a great idea to evaluate how the project went. You can do this a couple ways. One way is to look at the quality of student work. So did they meet the project objectives? And if they did, that's great. If not, then you can think about how to change it for the future. You can also ask for student feedback. So one thing I did was to do a survey at the end of the project, because I wanted to know how my students felt about the project. So let's look at that survey now. So the first few questions on the survey were about if the students felt their English improved. So the first item is, in general, this project improved my English. The second one is, this project improved my vocabulary, and then my spoken grammar, and so on. So I really wanted to know, did the students feel it was worthwhile? Did they feel like their English improved? because I felt it wouldn't, if they felt their English didn't improve, then maybe the project wasn't worth it. I also wanted to know if they liked the project. I want my students to be motivated so that they enjoy using and practicing English. So that helped me find out how the students felt about it. And I was really pleased to find out that almost every student said that they liked the project. So I was pleasantly surprised by that. Finally, the last thing that I asked was how much work they spent. I was really concerned that because they were editing videos, that it would really be a lot of work for the students, a lot of work outside of class. And so I asked them, and surprisingly for me, almost every student said it was a reasonable amount of work. I got lots of comments to the effect of, well, we did a lot of work on this project, but I learned a lot and I felt it was really good for me and for my future. And that reminds me, earlier, I asked the question about the challenges, about how did I teach the students to edit the videos? So some of you might be wondering about that. And the answer is, I didn't teach the students to edit the videos. I knew my students were way more tech savvy than me and that they would be able to figure it out. And sure enough, in the groups, they were able to figure it out really well and come up with products that were way better than anything I could have taught them to create. So that was something nice about this project for me. Okay, so back to the survey. One thing about giving a survey is you want to figure out how to get honest feedback from the students. Sometimes students will be too nice. They'll be extra nice because they don't want to hurt your feelings. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe they'll just provide really mean comments if they don't like the project. So I gave my students an anonymous survey. I told them don't write your names. And then I actually left the room when they did the survey and had a student representative collect the surveys and give them to me later. Another way you could do this is by having it be a group survey. So students do the survey in groups. And I think that would get you some really honest answers. Well,
wonderful. I just wanted to say real quickly before we move on, just how many people have been excited about these tools that you're sharing with us on the slides. So thank you so much. A lot of people saying thank you for the rubrics and the survey templates that they will use in their classroom. And as you probably have seen, participants, you can access these slides and the recording soon on our webinar resource center that moderator Elena is sharing in the chat and the comments. So thanks, everyone.
Great, that's wonderful to hear. Now we'll move on to our last topic of the webinar, and that's how to adapt project ideas to your students. So sometimes you might go to a conference and hear about some great project idea, or maybe you read it in a journal, but then you think, well, I don't really think that's going to work for my students. But there might be ways that you can adapt it for your students. So let's look at a few ways to adapt a project for your teaching context. First, let's just think about this news reporter project we've been talking about. How could you adapt it to different contexts? The first context would be limited technology resources. So maybe your students don't have access to computers. So how would you do it? One way would be to change the format. You might, instead of doing a video, change it to a live newscast. The students would still get to think about the problem. They would still write their script. They would still practice doing the script, and then they would perform it. It would just be live instead of on video. Another way is you could do a poster presentation, perhaps, and invite other classes and teachers. So what about the next context? If you have beginning level students, so I did this with university students that were fairly advanced. So how would you do this with beginning level students? Kate, how do you think you would adapt this for beginners?
Yeah, I think possibly I would change it to a simpler topic like weekend activities or foods or that sort of thing so that students' vocabulary would match the project a little bit better.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. They could still do a news report format, but it would just be on a simpler topic that they were able to talk about. Another context you might have is large classrooms. So it might be hard for you to manage a lot of projects when you have many different groups. One way you might be able to make it work is to slightly increase the group size, but I'd be careful too, because the more students are in the group, the less practice each student will probably get. With this particular project, I'd say 4 is probably a good maximum number. Another way is, so if you don't have time for all the groups to present, you might post the videos online, and then students can watch some of those videos and comment on those. So you can have some kind of peer assessment happening there. So now I have a question for you, and that is, what's one way you could adapt the news report project for a multi-level class? Because I know that many of you, in fact, probably all of you, have classes with multiple levels of students.
Yeah, let us know, everyone. Yeah, I think that's a common issue in the English language classroom, is that we have students of various levels. So what would you think? What do you think, everyone? How would you maybe change the news report for a multi-level class? Let's see. Joelma says, I would divide the big project into smaller projects. Great idea. Irene says she would put the students in mixed groups. Great. Michael says different topics, or maybe people can choose their topics. Let's see. Javed says that he would assign them into groups for a multi-level class. Osran says he would give the students the option to select their own problem. Great. Wonderful. So I think a lot of people would put students into groups and maybe give them choice. Yoko says he would assign roles. Great idea. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, those are great ideas for that. And having them choose topics and being able to choose topics they feel comfortable with, I think could really help. So more advanced students could have more advanced topics and so on. So let's just summarize a few ways to adapt some project ideas. So if you're in a limited resource or technology context, one way is just to change the format. So like I said earlier, my newscast project, if you didn't have a projector or if students couldn't access computers, you could change it to a live performance. If your students are at a different proficiency level, than the particular project usually works with, then you might simplify or change the topic. So for example, with the news report project, advanced students could analyze the causes and effects of a community issue. Intermediate students might just describe the community issue. And if you have beginning students, perhaps they could just change the topic to something simpler, like Kate said earlier, reporting on classmates' weekend activities. Another way you can do this is to provide a language frame, and we'll look at an example in just a moment. Now, if you feel a project is irrelevant to your teaching context, but you like the project idea, you might be able to change the topic. So, for example, my college students reported on a community issue, but elementary students wouldn't be able to do that, and it wouldn't really be relevant to them. So maybe for elementary students, you could have them report on a school activity or something happening at school. Now let's think about how you could adapt a specific project idea. In this case, adapting a cultural website project. So this is a project for high proficiency students, and they need to create a website about local culture. They need to include photos, video, and articles. So now take a moment and think about how you could adapt this project for low proficiency students. Kate, how do you think you would adapt this for low proficiency students?
Yeah, let's see. Maybe to adapt for lower level students, I might just have them focus on one aspect of culture that's maybe a little bit easier in terms of vocabulary, like food or maybe even holidays or something like that. And then the students can just focus on one specific grammar point and maybe simpler vocabulary.
Yeah, great. I think that's a great idea. If you focus on holidays, you can focus in on simple present and vocabulary related to celebrations and holidays. And then along with that, one thing you can do is to provide a language frame for the students. So this would be an example if the topic was food and they were describing food in their culture. You could provide a frame for a paragraph where the sentences have some blanks for the students to fill in with the vocabulary they know. Like the food in this place is sweet or spicy or salty. This food is a popular dish. It is made of this, this, and this. So that's another idea for lower level students. Now let's consider another example. In this case, it's a survey project for college students with high English proficiency. Their task is to conduct a survey to learn about students' media use. how they use social media, how they use music and movies and other things like that. Then they need to analyze the survey results and give a PowerPoint presentation. So now it's your turn. Think of one way you could adapt this project for elementary school students and type your idea in the chat.
All right, so taking a look at this survey project, what might you do to adapt this for elementary school students? Great, Michael says drawing pictures. Great, so instead of maybe the pictures could be on the survey. Wonderful. What other ways could you adapt this survey project? Let's see. Students could create posters instead. You could do simple checklists or yes, no, and students could ask each other rather than everyone in the school. Students could focus on a more basic idea from Yen Lee. They could do a game, and they could create simple questionnaires. And a lot of other people saying they could do more drawings. Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, wonderful. I think the idea of having students, elementary or primary school students, doing pictures and posters is really great, as many elementary students might have trouble making a PowerPoint. And then also just simplifying the topic or simplifying the survey in some way. Those are wonderful ideas. So we've covered a lot of ground in today's session. We talked about the benefits of project-based learning, particularly how it can be locally relevant and also encourage critical thinking. We took an in-depth look at the news report project, and then we talked about steps to design a project, like designing your objectives and the parameters, using rubrics for assessment, and then evaluating the project at the end. And finally, we talked about ways to adapt projects for students in different contexts. I hope this webinar has given you some inspiration for how you might use projects with your students. To end today's session, we'd like to hear your ideas. So what's one idea from today's webinar that you'd like to try with your students?
Let us know, everybody. Yeah, this was a wonderful webinar. So many great ideas shared. What is one idea that you would like to try with your students? Yes, Karima, I agree. Very inspiring presentation today. I know that a lot of people are going to use the rubric that you shared with us, Jeremy. Many people had made comments about how they would like to use that. Manuel also says he'll use more rubrics. Let's see. Gaukar says he'll have his students create works like posters and newsletters. That's wonderful. Caroline says she'll try the survey. Miriam says she'll incorporate more discussion. A lot of people saying thank you and showing us some applaud icons. Wonderful. And Adila and many others are saying that they would use rubrics, and also people are saying they would like to use more interviews. Wonderful. Thanks so much, everyone.
All right. Yes, thank you for sharing, and thanks for the comments. If you'd like to learn more about project-based learning and find ideas for projects you might use, here are some references that I used to prepare this presentation. I just want to thank you so much for joining me for today's webinar. It was really a pleasure for me to be able to share some of the ideas I've used as a teacher, and I hope that you've learned something that will be helpful for you and your students as well.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for that wonderful presentation. And as I said, so many people expressing their thanks and their enthusiasm for using these new tools and ideas in their classrooms.